Welcome, everyone, to TheoCon, where theology meets pop culture, where faith meets fiction, and the sacred meets the secular. I am here with my TheoCon team and our special guest for this hour. I am Shayna Watson, the founder and creator of TheoCon, and I serve as a priest in the Episcopal Church in Pennsylvania. And I will allow my team to introduce themselves, Brian and then Will.
Hi, I am Brian Bennett. I'm a campus pastor in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, serving students at Pitt, Carnegie Mellon, Chatham, and Carlow universities. I'm also the founder and co-host of the Church of the Geek podcast, looking at the intersection of the comic and the divine.
Awesome. I am Will Rose. I am parish pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church and Lutheran Campus Ministry in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and been part of the TheoCon steering committee for the last couple of years, and I lead a humble God Loves Geeks book club in my congregation, and have been a part of things like North Carolina Comic-Con and leading panels where God meets comics, or finding God in comics, or faith and fandom, all those kinds of things that swirl around theology and pop culture. And so I'm a big comic book geek and love graphic novels and sci-fi, and been great to be a part of TheoCon and a part of the conversations we're having, that with all the themes and topics that surround that. And really excited to have Evan with us today to talk about a pretty incredible book that I discovered about a year ago.
Great. And so as we enter into our Theo conversation, we will allow Evan, our special guest, to introduce himself as will moderate it and ask questions about his graphic novel, The Harrowing of Hell. This is going to be a really interesting conversation, especially as many in the Christian faith look toward what we call Holy Week and observing the passion of Christ, Christ's journey toward the cross, his crucifixion, being alive, then dying, and then being buried. And in many of our creeds and doctrines in our churches, some ascribe to what is called the Apostles' Creed or the Athanasius Creed, and there are many other, Nicene Creed, and I'm sure there are tons of other creeds that many churches recite. So I'm going to share the Apostles' Creed and then turn the mic over to Will to introduce our guests and get into our Theo conversation. So the Apostles' Creed reads as follows. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there he will come to judge the living and the dead. Some versions say the quick and the dead. I like the quick and the dead version better. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Amen. And so it is the harrowing of hell, which describes Jesus's descent into hell, through which this book, this graphic novel that Will is holding up, is inspired. Oh, and Brian is holding up. I tried to get a virtual background, but I couldn't get the full book into my square.
You just have a flag hanging back
I
here.
know. So it's just like red flames in the background. I'm like, maybe not. So it is with that, Jesus' descent into hell, that brings us into this conversation today. And Will, I'm going to pass it over for you to allow Evan to introduce himself, and let's get the Theo conversation started.
Yeah, we were just sharing about how reciting the creed growing up in the Lutheran Church. There's a part of the creed where it said descended into hell, and I always thought that was cool when I was a kid because I got to cuss in church. But then they changed it in our hymnal with a rubric that said descended to the dead, and then underneath they made this fine tiny print that said, or could say descended into hell. And I was like, man, we changed it. But
The Lutherans.
that's us Lutherans, we're edgy in other ways, I guess.
To be clear, we didn't do that. The International Consultation of English in the Liturgy, they made it, and we just used it. So nobody else uses it. I'm just saying, we didn't change it.
Right. We're just keeping people on their toes and stuff. Well, Evan, introduce. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do, and a little bit of your origin story, and then I'll share how I discovered your book, and then we'll talk about your book.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Evan. I live in Brooklyn. I am from North Carolina. Also, actually, I moved here like 10 years ago. I've been a cartoonist or graphic novelist since like 2006-ish. Most of my work has been like fantasy adventure stuff that I self-published online and in print. The Harrowing of Hell came out, I think, around exactly a year ago, and is the first thing really anything like that I've done before. But basically, I've just been a full-time cartoonist, mostly making my own work for much of that time. That's me. I grew up Episcopalian and had the same relationship to the Apostles' Creed, saying hell in it and feeling like that's cool. But thinking about it, like it feels kind of more accurate to me to say descended to the dead, because we have this very weird new image of what hell is that's a little incompatible with the original idea to me. I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought about that a lot when I was making this book.
Right. Now, did you pitch this to Iron Circus Comics, or did they come to you and say, we have an idea? Where they originate with that publisher?
Yeah, Iron Circus is mostly my friend Spike, who's a great cartoonist in her own right in Chicago. I've been wanting to work with, I had been wanting to work with her on a book for a long time, and a couple other things had fallen through. But this is something that I knew would be interesting to her just aesthetically, and a little too weird and argumentative of a premise to pitch to a more sort of mainstream publisher, I guess, is what it seemed like to me, and turned out great. You know, I'm happy with working with her on it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it was about a year ago. We were in pandemic mode, and who'd thunk we'd still be in pandemic mode, and we got to do another Lent and Holy Week and Easter in this same kind of pandemic mode. But it was about a year ago. One of the members of my church who was helping us do live stream our worship services, as I mentioned, I do a God Loves Geeks book club here in our church, whether it's Marvel or DC, or go see a movie, or we just pick a graphic novel and read it a month, kind of like any normal kind of book club. But this member of my church who helps us with the live stream, he normally doesn't attend our God Loves Geeks book club, but keeps in contact and asks questions and stuff. And he sent me this, random email with a link to the book and said, "Hey, this would be interesting. You ever thought about doing something like this?" And I immediately was like, "Ooh, yeah, that looks really good," and ordered it immediately. And you can, because of its art and silent pages, you can read it in one sitting. And just sat down and just read it all the way through, and was really moved by it. And so then I was thinking, like, oh, that'd be great to have a conversation about this book with TheoCon, especially as we get into Holy Week and meditate and reflect on the passion of Christ. So really, really cool. Yeah, since you have, it is one of those things where we have Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and then there's Silent Saturday. And tradition has it within the church that is the day of Christ descending among the dead, or among hell, to break the chains of death and then rising again. And so, but we are a little quiet about that. There's, church isn't necessarily super full on Good Friday. I know in our tradition, if we have an Easter vigil, it's kind of long, so people don't a whole lot. We don't have a big crowd that comes to Easter vigil, but then Easter Sunday's jam packed, and they would hear the story of the empty tomb. But that, to focus in on that line of the creed, or that part of the Christian tradition or story, is kind of often forgotten about, or swept under, or ignored, or intently, or or unconsciously. So yeah, this book focusing on one part was pretty amazing. Opened up a whole different way of looking at things. Tell me about the process of how you got to this book, and then perhaps what made you fill in the gaps or the details of the story that aren't necessarily in the Bible or in the creed itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is pretty absent from how a lot of people, I'm not deeply aware of what Christianity is, these days personally, but it does seem kind of conspicuously absent, and I've always understood that as it, because it's such a wild and ridiculous idea, kind of like, it's so spectacular, and it's so outside of the normal story of Jesus's death and resurrection as it's normally talked about. What attracted me to it was, well, it's a spectacular story that suggests a lot visually, just the idea of Jesus going into hell or some sort of pre-hell underworld, but then over the course of several years, I got interested in sort of Christian anarchism, I guess, and I really got a lot out of a couple things I read by Jacques Ellul, the French Christian anarchist, and John Dominic Crossan,
Mm-hmm.
who's I've only read one book of his, but just I love his analysis of the Gospels as political, basically, and kind of putting aside every other concern, as I do when I look at them. And it struck me that it kind of is it's almost like a punchline to make a story that has a Christian anarchist political argument like that, but it's textually about Jesus going into this place of cosmic punishment, right? Like, there's this interesting contradiction there that kind of motivated the whole project to me. Yeah, and hell is something that is, I feel like it got kind of built into a particular thing and literalized starting in like the medieval period, right? But a lot of what I was trying to do was build something out just from the raw material of the Gospels, in particular the Gospel of Mark, to like generate hell as if nobody had thought of it before or something like that. Like, to make this dark underworld place that is entirely thematically about punishment and entirely thematically about just exaggerating and intensifying the Roman corporal punishment logic that dominates the gospel stories, and having that be what it's about more than any sort of more fantastical like medieval vision or like Dante vision of hell or whatever. So those are like the sort of motivating ideas I had going into it, I guess.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it hits me a little differently, the rereading it this year, a little differently because what we've experienced politically over the last 4 years, that there is this deep tension between religious and political life, polarization, and a lot of people are talking about there's a certain look. Pastors and ministers who are getting too political in the pulpit are saying, wait a minute, have you not read the Gospels for the trial of Jesus? When it comes to it's deeply political, you can't escape it. In fact, there is a page here, I forgot what page, let's see, I think it's page 77 in the graphic novel. You have Jesus talking about when flipping over the tables in the temple, God or Caesar. And then I've just read this book with my congregation, Jesus versus Caesar by Jörg Rieger, and it's fantastic, talking about this tension between the Jesus movement, the Jesus way, and the political powers that be in our world. And so are we a people that are just going along with status quo, or are we looking at the true nature of what happened to Jesus, what happened? So anyway, that being said, like it really, your book hit me differently this year and in a good way, as I'm wrestling with that within my own congregation and society and family when it comes to faith and politics. And what you portray in your book is only three colors. It's black and white and red. And your use of red conveys this dichotomy or this kind of parallel between Jesus's earthly trial and then this trial or temptation that happens in hell, in the underworld, among the dead. And this play with the color of red helps see the continuity between the two. What was that? Your choice? Was it somebody else's? Was that how did that go into your creation?
It's my choice. Spike had a very light editorial hand, so it's all basically the weird thing I wanted to make. But I love working with like very limited color and emphasizing the brush work. This is all drawn with like an actual brush and ink.
Oh, wow.
And all of hell being like red just seemed like striking and an exciting idea. But then as I developed that, I got really excited about red as this sort of key color to talk about punishment, right? Because the way that I understand, and I'm not a Christian, I'm a person with political convictions who reads the Gospels in particular as political documents, basically.
Right.
But the way that I read the crucifixion and resurrection in Mark in particular is like, it's Jesus running up against the fallacious punishment logic of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And then his resurrection, I think that to look at something written 2,000 years ago and be like, and to see it as like, this is a journalistic account of a thing that happened, doesn't do justice to how people were writing and reading at that time. But
Right.
his resurrection being seen as like this, it's mocking of Rome's supposed authority to do something like that, right? Like they say they have the right to kill this person, but they can't. Like there's no, it's this beautiful like anti-punitive story to me. So that made me think about just red, the color red as a way of just emphasizing all these punitive structures. Naturally, all of hell is red because hell is about punishment, but then also the cross is red, and the Romans all dressed in red because their armor is or they're like the robes that the soldiers wore was historically red anyway. And then I forget what else. There's a couple. Oh yeah, when the guy is painting the INRI on the
Right.
on the board, the Rex is in red because that's like the punishment authority, you know. So I don't know. It's kind of like cheeky and too on the nose, but I like being able to push that and to help, because it's kind of an adaptation of the apocryphal story and it's kind of an adaptation of Mark, but also it's just kind of making a very limited argumentative course through those texts, you know.
Yeah, and so the
I think
cross
it's
being kind of a no. Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
just to follow up on the red. Number one, I'm a big fan. That's why I wore this flannel, because the red, black, and white was awesome. But you even have a big like double page spread further on with Jesus coming back in that triumph. When he's talking to Satan, and he had right when Jesus returns, as Satan says, that as they even imagine you like coming like this. He's got the sword, he's got the standard bit with him. Even Jesus is wearing a red crown, right? Like that's an image that resonates with so many people. That's the Jesus we want. We don't want the Jesus who walks through hell and just opens up prisons, tears out gates. So that was maybe one of my favorite images in the book. That continued using that red. I think it's the only place where Jesus has red, if it's not blood. But
yeah. And you got to think like the message that like the message is so anti-imperial and anti-violence and anti-punishment that Jesus had, that it kind of had to be compromised in that way to stick around in any way, or something. There's some weird tension there.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, like it contradicts itself in its history, kind of.
Right. I, I, I two things I wanted. Let me start with this. I was curious as I read this if the Orthodox icon of the resurrection, which is the harrowing of hell, was a seed or an influence in this for you?
Not particularly. I mean, I looked at a lot of different visual material and working through how it would all look, and a lot of it is Orthodox imagery of the harrowing, but no, not really. I mean, I mostly started from very simple premises of just
No, that's
having.
fine. I had a sense, like, particularly as Jesus works his way through hell, right? And the people in the who are being imprisoned there, right? They're calling out to him, and he's just tearing out gates. And in the icon of the resurrection, Jesus stands over this chasm, right? And the doors of hell have fallen into a cross shape, but then there's all these keys that are falling in the background, right? For that, like the gates and doors of hell have been rent asunder.
Mhm.
So I was curious if that had played part of that. That's all I was.
And also in that icon, he's grabbing Adam and Eve by the hands, pulling them up out of the grave. So
Right.
Adam and Eve representing humanity, this kind of pulling up out. And there's part of that towards the end of the book too, of this extra level of, it looks like perhaps Adam and Eve or the original sinners are down there, and where they choose to be pulled up out of the grave or not is there in the story.
A lot of that I got from just directly from the what's it called, the Gospel of Nicodemus, the apocryphal story. That's I think the first attested story of the harrowing that a lot of the imagery flows out of, and that like later ideas of hell kind of owe a lot to. But it talks a lot about Adam and Eve, but a lot of that story is just like kind of doing this this almost comic booky retcon thing where all of the all of your favorites from the Old Testament in the afterlife get to verbally affirm that this is the guy they were talking about. It's very, it's kind of funny.
Yeah. Retconning happens a lot. Well, yeah. And going back to what Brian was talking about, that spread page, that beautiful spread page, it's page 96, 97 of this kind of war, this last temptation of Christ to embrace, to be Satan, Caesar's, Satan's, however you want to put it, to kind of right hand dude to go out blazing on a war horse with a warrior and a sword and a crown that's in red. I mean, that leading up to this, the means of torture used by the state are painted in red. So the crown of thorns, the whip, the cross is in red, and then here this crown that Christ has, this warrior Christ, superhero Christ that everybody dreams of with a cape coming out, has a red crown on it, and that's the kind of the turning point. And I think what I enjoyed about this book so much that helped reframe for me, that often, Jesus, after 2,000 years of religion and Christology and theology laid upon Jesus, we envision Jesus as this superhero, godlike figure, rather than remembering that we also confess him 100% human. That when you have these flashbacks to his ministry and life, whether on the boat or healing the blind man or in the temple, he's a rabbi who is fully human, who wrestles with fear and anxiety and uncertainty and what's coming up next. And I'm learning as I go, and I'm trying to be faithful to this tradition that I'm a part of. And so for me, that was that reminder of that humanity of Jesus, that perhaps, I don't want to spoil it in the book, but Easter's coming, that he's almost as surprised that he is resurrected or come to a new beginning as anyone else. And I remember Brian, we had this, I think we had the same. Do we have Dr. Siegel? Did you have Dr. Siegel as well for Greek?
No, I didn't get a class with him.
Well, I remember him in New Testament Greek in the Gospels. He even like floated the idea that perhaps Jesus too was surprised that he was resurrected, that maybe he was talking of a son of man to come that he didn't know quite yet whether he was that son of man or not. And then the resurrection was like, oh man. So there was that element of surprise even for Jesus that blew my mind of like, oh, wow, maybe. So, anyway, that to be said, that your play in terms of your portrayal of Jesus along the way, his flashbacks to his ministry help frame the Christ or the Jesus that set the vision for you for the whole book and just conclusion.
Yeah, well, I mean, I got really hung up on doing those flashbacks when I was doing development for the book, and like getting just kind of fixated on the Gospel according to Mark as this like way through it, and that there would be no way to talk through any of this without showing bits of that Gospel in particular. The thing about so I was originally, when I pitched this, I was talking about it as like a deconstructive adaptation, like it's kind of an adaptation of the Harrowing, but it's not triumphant in the way that the Harrowing is normally told. Like all the stuff still happens and he still makes it through and is resurrected, but in meeting the implicitly Satan guy, he's shown how it's a failure, kind of, right? Like it's true that people see him as this conquering hero. It's true that people will see him as an instrument of the stuff that he has built his whole life around defying. And I like the idea of Adam and Eve refusing the salvation themselves. Maybe that's just like cheeky, but it's a way of talking about the idea, and like we're in a real punishment culture, and wow. It became a kind of good metaphor for me to talk about liberatory things turned in that way. Maybe it's an idea I'm still thinking about, I guess.
Yeah, and with the events of happening January 6th, where there's people that have Jesus flags and are beating cops with it, or think if they're going to take over the Capitol, being this understanding of the way of Jesus that's antithetical to empire, versus a conquering Lord who gives me the permission to go and beat down my enemy. It just hit home in a different way in terms of again, and also the book Jesus versus Caesar by Dr. Rieger really helped think through what is the God of Caesar and what is the God of Jesus, and where is the tension? And the tension's always been there. If we think this is those pastors who are in a tight spot within their congregation with faith and politics, it's like, wait a minute, it's always been a part of our tradition from the very, very beginning. And so, although I read your book last year around Holy Week, it was impactful. It hits from a different angle this year, post January 6th, 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something that you mentioned, Evan, that I kind of want to circle back to, and it's an interesting concept, and I've been hearing it more and more over the past couple of decades from Pope Francis and even from some liberation theologians who talk about Christ's failure, the failure of the cross, and it ending Christ's human life. However, it's the divinity that carries on triumvirally. So it's an interesting concept. And I remember being in seminary and first hearing that, like, what do you mean Christ failed? Like, no, he knew this was coming and everything was all, but it's like, no, what if this, the murder of a murder of God in the flesh. And I find that your storytelling powerful, and it also makes that myth and legend more realized. It's like, so what did Christ do on Saturday? Oh, he went down to hell. It's like this is how Jesus spent his Saturday, setting people free, and then he had to go because he had to return to God the Father in heaven. So it does expand the imagination and brings everyone to pause, whether Christian or not, whether Christian or atheist or otherwise, agnostic, to really think about the possibilities of what does sacrifice look like and what happens after that. Like it's because of one man's death that these others are find freedom or liberation in some, strange, unfortunate way. But I was curious. I mean, I know all of our theology is our theological skirts are showing right now. But I'm just curious about, like what are some of your thoughts around that, around having to die in order to set others free? Because I'm thinking about the deaths of the many, as Will had pointed out, especially in light of pandemic and protest, and like, is there redemption in any of that? And some of the things that we define as senseless acts, um, Christ's death, did it need to be so in order for people to be freed from these gates of hell? So just kind of curious about that. You don't necessarily have to comment on it. There's nothing viewed as heretical, obviously, on this show. It's just, we're all seeking and exploring, and I just find this, my imagination is running wild now. It's like, wow, like what if someone said, in order to free these people, you will have to be persecuted. You will have to suffer da 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 in order to enter into this realm that falls outside of our typical way of thinking about human time and space.
Mhm.
So anyway, I just got a little nerdy.
Yeah, I love hearing that framing. That's it's not how I engage with the text of the Gospels. I mean, I sort of built my understanding in kind of a literary way, and like look at I read them and look at like what the events of Jesus' death and resurrection sort of accomplish in the text of the thing is how I don't know, I have maybe a more of a dispassionate sort of literary angle on it. But you're talking about I'm interested in that idea of like the failure. Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in what you mean about the failure, I guess.
Sure. Well, you had mentioned it, and it just made me think about, for example, this was an older writing of theologian James Cone, Black liberation theologian, that talked about, Christ failed on the cross. Like this wasn't about being victorious, but in Christ's distress, for example, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and told his followers to keep watch and they fell asleep, part of his prayer was to let this cup pass.
Mhm.
Like Jesus did not want to go. And, we don't really talk a lot about Jesus's mental health and well-being. There's that whole, yes, he's all divine, and yet there's the all human part, the part that, felt the pain, felt the suffering and the agony and did not want to go.
And the doubting, like you're struck by how much he doesn't know what's going to happen,
Yeah, right. And it was just kind of like when they showed up to take him. And I know if people try to ascribe the story of one of his followers striking off the ear of one of the soldiers. They gave that part to Peter, but I don't think the person really had a name. And Jesus, picked up the guard's ear off the ground and put it back on him and said, my time is here. Like, don't fight this because it will become more violent. Just let me. I will go and carry this out. So it wasn't seen in this failure of the cross. It wasn't seen as a victory per se, but rather it showed us human depravity. Like it was a homicide, it was a murder, and we tortured a human being along with others. Like utilizing the cross wasn't this unique situation to Christ. It highlighted a means of punishment for people at the time to make an example out of them. So when they talk about failure of the cross, it wasn't so much in the light of like, someone failed a test, but rather the cross and the passion isn't necessarily what people have romanticized it to be. Because as it was mentioned earlier, we look at Good Friday, Jesus died, and then we look at the anastasis, the resurrection on Sunday, but that Saturday, everyone's just kind of like, doing whatever while Jesus is hanging out with the
Well,
dead.
you need a day to dye your eggs.
What's that?
You need a day to get your eggs dyed.
Yeah, that was the Easter. Jesus
That's
like,
Saturday.
I'm gonna go to the grave while you all, do your Easter egg hunting. But yeah, so there's the concept of failure, and I might be doing a poor job of really explaining it without having the materials in front of me. But Pope Francis even talked about it, how Jesus's death highlights both, what failure and victory look like. Because we are not, and especially in our westernized culture, we focus on the victory, we focus on the triumph. We don't know how to deal with failure, and oftentimes how we manage our feelings around failure ends in annihilation of the other. So it's like, we don't always have to be the winners. And what does it look like being in this faith community where we're not always the winners, or maybe, that winning and losing language? Would our faith and how we encounter other people look like if
Yeah.
we didn't deal with that type of language at all? So
Well,
it's a very broad concept, and I'm sure I'm not doing it much justice, but I just wanted
no,
to.
I follow you. But yeah, Rome built all the arches of triumph, right? That's a Roman thing. That's not really a Christian
Very
thing,
empirical.
And there's a way in which, like, the way that I understand the failure is that, like, there's a triumph uh, in the resurrection as a refutation of Roman authority in particular, like the occupying forces authority. But then they still occupied, and that story is endlessly rehashed in the service of other occupying powers. So that's a profound failure. But the extent to which, I mean, you could look at it as the extent to which the story continues to hold on as a parable of resistance against that is a kind of a victory, or a kind of power that still can persist. But I say that as like a, I don't know. I don't know that that's really my belief, but that's a way that you could look at it.
Well,
Thank
Shayna mentioned James Cone, and the move he makes is in his book that I can't recommend enough is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Is this move that Jesus was lynched by the state or executed, and so he identifies with the marginalized, the oppressed, specifically the black man who was lynched by white supremacy, and so that's his theological move that moves into some liberation theology that's just incredible, and I can't recommend that book enough. And then that part over the course of Lent, our congregation has done a series on grief, because one of my worries is coming out of this pandemic is that we are going to go back to life as normal and let's just pretend nothing happened and sweep it on the rung. But where we've all experienced a sense of PTSD and grief, we've all lost something, whether it's a loved one or a time or a conference that I really wanted to go to. We all lost something that we're grieving. And so what does that look like? So even in the garden where Jesus says he is grieved even unto death, that he experiences that same grief that we do, that doubt, that uncertainty, and what's going to happen next, the anxiety of what the future holds. He's trying to pull these followers together, and he's trained them for 3 years, and here they are sleeping, and he wants them to love one another and continue his work, but it's hard. And in your flash book, tying back to your book, the flashbacks of ministry, that there's that sense the disciples are like, do we know who he is? What's going on? Who is he really? There's uncertainty on their part. Is he John the Baptist? Is he not? Is he just one of the prophets? Those are the things that they're wrestling with. And again, we romanticize Easter, Good Friday. My grandma said, well, you can't have, she got so mad when like the church wasn't as crowded on Good Friday as it was on Easter. Where were these people on Good Friday? Why didn't they hear the other part of the story? Because Easter's just easier to lean into with our peeps and dyed eggs and pretty dresses, but that the passion and the death and the failure is part. And that's what I found your book so refreshing, is that his life, Christ's life, in plain, simple, black and white, leading towards a new opening and a new story at the end is great. And then one more thing, when Shayna talked about expanding our imagination, I think that's what the heart of what we're trying to do with TheoCon and God Loves Geeks and Church of the Geek is, that we're saying we're giving people permission to take these stories that we love to open our imagination. And often in the church, we don't use that same imagination that we use when it comes to a sci-fi film or a graphic novel or whatever we're geeking out on, to the scriptures, to let our imagination run wild of what can happen in that space. And that's where we feel that God can move in and inspire and lead, when we expand our imaginations of how we share this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had been like familiar with like the New Testament my whole life, but just approaching it like having this idea that I want to make this book, and that will require me to like read through this stuff in this particular like focused and directed way that is not how anybody is really encouraged to read it. It seems like that was it really helped me sort of appreciate it and help me to like resonate with it, you know. And there's a lot of, I think people understand this about a lot of religion. People understand understand it as like, you can't really, hang on. You can read the text, but if you can either accept all of its sort of mystical premises and then you identify with the religion it presupposes, or not, you know. But it's just, there's a lot of profoundly like beautiful, really politically argumentative stuff in here that it was great for me to work through, and I'm happy that I didn't let myself run into the wall of, you know, having to totally sign off, either having to like totally sign off on the particular folkloric or mystical reading of it, or to do the like sort of reactionary thing of just making something really like brutal and anti-Christian and like smug atheist with it, you know.
Right.
Because I have been that in other points in my life, but yeah, I don't know. I got a lot out of the Gospel of Mark, just reading it.
I wanted to come back to Mark because I feel like that was the perfect gospel for you to pick. And as I was reading your, not the Gospel of Mark, but as I was reading the Harrowing of Hell, there was a moment where I was like, I think he definitely went off of the Gospel of Mark here. Like there was just something about a phrase or something that the way it was, I don't remember what it was at this point, but I remember thinking, I was like, that sounds like Mark. And it makes a lot of sense. The Harrowing of Hell and Mark is this sort of apocalyptic struggle that Jesus has in sort of getting rid of hell. And so that's a lovely part. And the focus really is, I think, on the Roman oppression of the people. I did appreciate that, in a sense, the Jews weren't the bad guy.
Yeah.
Right. The bad guy are the Romans. The bad guy are the people who make you choose Caesar. Right. All of the apparatus of punishment. And so. So I thought that was a really, really great use throughout the book.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Well, and the well, even the later Gospels and you know, so much of the subsequent struck me as the one that's real conditions of the people, you know, the like there's a bunch of beautiful and interesting and like strange, more mystical aspects of, I guess, John in particular. But I'm really only interested in the like the implicit material content, I guess, something like that.
And this year for Easter, the liturgical churches use the Revised Common Lectionary and rotate the Gospels throughout each year. Mark is the Easter text for Mark's version of Easter that happens this Easter, and scholars will share that the text probably originally ended with this phrase of "and they were scared and they told no one." And you're kind of like, okay, then how do we get here 2,000 years ago? Is the question, the open-ended question Mark wants to leave with those who are listening, wants to play with their imagination about, okay, so then what happened then? Why are we sitting here? Why are we hearing this goodness if they didn't say anything to anybody? And that's fun to play with and think about, again, offering us an invitation for our imaginations to explore what does this story mean and why is it important to us or our community. So
it's so loose. I love just the structure of that gospel.
I saw a tweet the other day that said Matthew and Luke are the Snyder cut of Mark. So I was like, okay,
absolutely,
that works. Well, we're going to wrap up here. Shayna or Brian, are there any other questions about the Harrowing of Hell that you want to get out there for Evan about the book?
So many, but I know we do this show within like 45 minutes to an hour. So, I mean, I would love to follow up with Evan again, maybe either later this year or have our anniversary and see what other conversations may have come up as a result of Harrowing of Hell. And I would love to use this with, especially with our youth group. I'm sure there will be some adults who would want in on this conversation because in our Episcopal Church, hell is not something that is always a topic of conversation, if at all. It's in our creed, but we never really explore it. So I want to thank Evan for being a gift and for offering this graphic novel as a gift, not only to our communities, but also to the world. So thank you, Evan, for being such a blessing.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here. Thanks, y'all.
Evan, is there something that you're working on now that you want to plug or let our listeners know of what you're working on next and how they can find you?
Yeah, I'm Evan Dahm, Dahm on social mediums. I'm working on, I'm sort of resuming working on this extremely long fantasy graphic novel online called Vatu that's similarly concerned with questions of empire and punishment. I have a new book coming out in a couple months from First Second Books, which is the second in like a sort of all ages fantasy adventure story, a bunch of like colorful fantasy stuff.
Cool.
But I'm pretty easy to find.
Good.
I love it. I'm going to wait for the film.
The Harrowing of Hell film or the fantasy film? Which one?
Both.
Both.
You know, there are all these genres of dystopian and all this other stuff. I'm excited, Evan. I don't know what you have in mind, but yes, any type of a graphic novel, adapted film that has your name on it, I will be sure to watch.
I'm open to it.
Amazon Prime, The Harrowing of Hell, a 10 episode issue of Bringing Along would be pretty gritty. That would work. Cool. Well, thanks, Evan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
It's a great work. I think we would read it in our campus ministry for reflection and conversation. So it's worthwhile. It's really good.
Thank you so much.
All right.